The bell echoed sharply, signaling the start of Ms. Harlow's math class. As always, she commanded the room with an air of severity that made her students sit up straighter and lower their voices. Among them sat Ethan, an unassuming 12-year-old with tousled hair and eyes that held secrets beyond his years. He slouched slightly, his eyes trained on the blank page before him, mind likely wandering beyond the confines of the classroom. Miss Harlow's eyes zeroed in on Ethan. She took pride in spotting the weak links, as she'd once mentioned to a colleague in the faculty lounge. For her, every failure was a reflection of unpreparedness and lack of discipline, traits she despised. "Ethan," she called, her tone sharp as a knife, slicing through the quiet room. Heads turned toward him, curiosity sparking in their gazes. Miss Harlow held up a complex equation, the kind that left even her brightest students squirming. She motioned toward the board. "Why don't you solve this for us?" Ethan blinked, his cheeks flushing a faint pink. He stood slowly, eyes flitting between the board and his peers. Taking a deep breath, he approached the problem with hesitance, fingers brushing over his notebook, filled with neatly penned equations that Ms. Harlow couldn't see. As he stumbled over the first calculation, Ms. Harlow let out an exaggerated sigh, audible enough to evoke a snicker from a few classmates. "Ethan, honestly," she scolded, her voice dripping with disappointment. "If this is too challenging, perhaps you should consider paying more attention in class." The weight of her words settled heavily on Ethan, yet something in his eyes remained distant, untouched. Miss Harlow's scolding rolled off him, unnoticed in the whirlwind of his thoughts, a fleeting idea, an image, a vision of gears and circuits whirring to life, but he pushed it down, hastily scribbling an answer on the board. Wrong. Miss Harlow shook her head, crossing her arms with an exaggerated frown. "I'd expect better, even from you." The class let out a collective breath, a mix of relief and pity. But in the corner of the room, Sarah, a quiet, observant girl, watched Ethan with a look of intrigue, noticing the way his fingers danced over the numbers in his notebook as if he were solving equations far more advanced. As Ethan took his seat, Miss Harlow resumed the lesson, believing her point made. But if she had looked closer, if she'd noticed the quiet determination in his eyes, she might have seen a spark, one that hinted at something far beyond her understanding. Ethan walked home that afternoon in silence, replaying Miss Harlow's words in his head. Each step seemed to echo her disdain, and he couldn't shake the feeling of failure that clung to him. Yet, deep down, he knew the truth. The equations she marked him down for, the problems he'd solved in his notebook, those were merely stepping stones to something far greater. As he passed the gates of his school, his face softened. This route home had become his sanctuary, a place where his mind could roam freely, no longer bound by the rigid rules of Miss Harlow's classroom. He reached the narrow alley that served as a shortcut, allowing him to avoid the main road and the noisy chatter of his classmates. Here, he could think. He could breathe. With a quick glance around to make sure no one was watching, Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Its edges were frayed, its cover bent from countless trips in and out of his bag. He opened it to a page filled with a mixture of equations, diagrams, and cryptic notes that only he could understand. To an outsider, the scribbles looked random, but to Ethan, they were pieces of a puzzle he was slowly piecing together. His fascination with mechanics and numbers was more than a hobby. It was his escape, his sanctuary, and if anyone saw these pages, they might even glimpse the genius he hid so carefully. At home, Ethan slipped quietly through the front door, careful not to disturb his mother, who worked long hours at a local diner to support them. She was exhausted most of the time, and Ethan did his best not to add to her burdens. Today was no different. He tiptoed into his room, dropping his backpack by his desk and glancing around the small, cluttered space that was equal parts bedroom and laboratory. On his desk lay the beginnings of a project he'd been working on for weeks. A small mechanical device with parts scavenged from old radios, broken clocks, and even the occasional abandoned appliance he'd found by the roadside. The device looked unremarkable to anyone else, a jumble of wires and gears. But to Ethan, it was a masterpiece in progress. He pulled out his notebook and reviewed the calculations he'd made during class. Miss Harlow's criticisms had stung, but they didn't mean he'd abandoned his ideas. He had more pressing matters, like perfecting the timing mechanism that would make his project work seamlessly. As he adjusted a tiny gear, the door creaked open, and his mother peeked in, her face lined with fatigue, but softened with a gentle smile. "Ethan, honey, how was school?" Ethan tensed for a moment, caught off guard. It was fine, he murmured, tucking the notebook behind him instinctively. His mother's smile faded slightly as she noticed his reluctance to speak. She'd grown used to his quiet nature, his way of retreating into himself. But every once in a while, she wished he'd open up, share a bit more of what went on in that brilliant mind of his. "Are you sure everything's all right? You seem a little down," she asked, moving closer and glancing at the project on his desk with a puzzled look. Ethan nodded quickly, his gaze shifting to the floor. He didn't want to worry her, didn't want to add to the strain she already carried. "It's nothing, just school stuff, you know, the usual." She reached out, ruffling his hair gently. "All right, but remember, I'm here if you ever want to talk." With that, she left, leaving Ethan alone once more. He exhaled, feeling the familiar mixture of relief and sadness wash over him. His mother had no idea about his secret projects, about the world of ideas and inventions that existed only in his mind and within the pages of his notebook. And perhaps it was better that way. He didn't want her to worry about things she might not understand. Turning his attention back to his desk, Ethan felt the thrill of possibility bubbling within him. He picked up a thin metal rod and carefully inserted it into the device, watching as the gears clicked into place. This was his world, the place where he felt truly alive, unburdened by expectations or judgments. The hours passed quickly as he worked, lost in the rhythm of his creation. He tweaked, adjusted, and recalculated, oblivious to the fading light outside. When he finally looked up, it was dark, and a single thought crossed his mind. This could work. For the first time, his device showed signs of life, a faint hum emanating from it as he connected the final wire. A surge of excitement coursed through him. This wasn't just a small accomplishment, it was proof of what he was capable of. And though he hadn't yet decided exactly what his invention would do, he knew it had the potential to change things. A sudden knock on his window startled him, and he nearly dropped the device. He turned to see Sarah, his classmate, standing outside, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. She looked nervous, her hands clutching the straps of her backpack as she gestured for him to open the window. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. What was she doing here? He rarely spoke to anyone outside of school, let alone invited them into his private world. With a sigh, he pushed the window open, leaning out to meet her gaze. "Sarah? What are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I saw how Ms. Harlow treated you today, and I thought it wasn't fair. I know you're smarter than she thinks." Ethan felt his cheeks heat up in embarrassment and surprise. He hadn't expected anyone, least of all Sarah, to notice what he went through every day in that classroom. It's okay. I'm used to it," he mumbled, trying to dismiss her concerns. But Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a determination that surprised him. "You shouldn't have to be," she said firmly. "I think you're brilliant, Ethan, and I think you're hiding something big." She nodded toward his desk, where the device lay partially covered by a notebook. Ethan's heart pounded as he glanced back at his project, then at Sarah. How much had she seen? And more importantly, how much did she understand? "It's nothing," he said quickly, but his voice faltered under her steady gaze. "Just a hobby." "A hobby?" she echoed, arching an eyebrow. "Hobbies don't make people stay up half the night working with gears and equations." He looked down, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever tried to understand his world before, and he wasn't sure he wanted them to, but something in Sarah's expression told him that she wouldn't give up easily. Finally, he sighed, gesturing for her to come in. "Okay, but you can't tell anyone, not even Miss Harlow." A spark of excitement lit up her face as she climbed through the window, stepping carefully around the clutter on his floor. She approached his desk, her eyes widening as she took in the scattered parts and the intricate design of his project. "This is amazing," she whispered, reaching out to touch a small gear that glinted in the dim light. Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and vulnerability as he watched her examine his work. He'd never shared this part of himself with anyone, but as Sarah turned to him with a look of genuine admiration, he began to feel that maybe he didn't have to hide anymore. The next morning, Ms. Harlow sat at her desk, papers strewn in front of her, tapping her pen against her chin in agitation. Though she prided herself on her unshakable demeanor, something had unsettled her since yesterday's class. She couldn't shake the sight of Ethan's awkward hesitation and the quiet resilience in his eyes, which seemed to mock her authority without a word. As she looked out over the rows of empty desks, She remembered a conversation she'd had with the school principal just a few weeks prior. "Mrs. Harlow," the principal had said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepled, "we've noticed some complaints about your teaching methods. Some parents feel, well, they say your approach can be too harsh. They say it stifles students rather than supports them." The words had stung, though Miss Harlow hadn't let it show. After all, she had worked hard to gain respect and control in her classroom, even at the cost of her warmth. In her mind, discipline and structure were paramount. They forged strength just as they had for her. She shook her head to clear the memories and picked up her lesson plan for the day, reminding herself of her purpose. She didn't believe in mollycoddling students or lowering her standards to meet their expectations. Success required hard work, and she would push her students until they either met her standards or fell short. Yet, as she flipped through her grading book, she couldn't help but linger on Ethan's name. There was something about him that tested her patience. She told herself that his persistent daydreaming and lack of attention were signs of laziness. But the truth gnawed at her, whispering doubts she couldn't silence. What if he was more than he seemed? The bell rang, jolting her back to the present as students filed in. She straightened her posture, her eyes scanning each face until they landed on Ethan. He seemed even quieter today, yet there was an intensity about him, a focus she'd never noticed before. He slipped into his seat without a word, his eyes darting briefly to Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. The class began, and Miss Harlow resumed her usual routine. Equations filled the board, and her voice droned through instructions, but her mind kept drifting, her gaze returning to Ethan, who was scribbling in his notebook with unusual fervor. At one point, as she moved through the rows to check on her students' progress, she caught a glimpse of Ethan's notebook. To her astonishment, his page was filled not with the basic equations she'd assigned, but with complex diagrams and calculations far beyond what she had been teaching. It was as if he were working on something entirely different, in a language only he understood. "What is this?" she snapped, snatching the notebook from his desk. Ethan froze, his face paling as he looked up at her. It's nothing, just something I'm working on," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing? This doesn't look like nothing," Miss Harlow said, her voice laced with suspicion. "Are you wasting time on foolishness instead of focusing on your classwork?" He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the notebook in her hands. For a brief moment, Miss Harlow saw something fierce and defiant in his eyes, something that unnerved her. She wanted to dismiss it, to believe he was just another unfocused student. But as she flipped through the pages, she realized that his work was meticulous, detailed, and astonishingly advanced. She closed the notebook and handed it back to him, her fingers lingering on its cover, as if trying to decide what to say. A part of her wanted to reprimand him, to insist he stay on task. But another part, a smaller, more curious part, couldn't help but wonder what was going on inside his mind. "Just stay focused on the classwork," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. She turned quickly, retreating to her desk and feeling a strange mixture of irritation and intrigue. But as the lesson continued, she kept glancing at him, trying to reconcile the quiet, withdrawn boy she thought she knew with the brilliance hinted at in those pages. As the school day ended, Sarah waited near the door, her gaze fixed on Ethan as he packed up his things. She'd seen how Ms. Harlow had reacted to his notebook, the way her expression had shifted from anger to surprise. Sarah's mind was racing, filled with questions and an urge to learn more about the mysterious project Ethan was working on. When the last of their classmates had left, she approached him cautiously. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice hesitant, Can I talk to you about something?" He looked up, startled, then nodded. They walked down the hall together in silence, finding a quiet corner near the school's side entrance where they wouldn't be disturbed. Ethan avoided her gaze, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Yesterday, when you showed me that project, I want you to know I think it's amazing," she began, her cheeks flushed with nervous excitement. "I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's incredible. How did you learn to do all that?" Ethan shrugged, his face reddening. "I don't know. I like figuring things out. Math, engineering, they're like puzzles to me." "But why don't you ever talk about it?" Sarah pressed, her tone gentle. "I mean, you're obviously really talented. I don't understand why you hide it." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, his expression darkening. "Because people don't get it," he replied, his voice tight. "Miss Harlow, the other teachers, they all think I'm just some slacker. They don't want to know what I can do. They just want me to do what they tell me." Sarah felt a pang of sympathy as she looked at him. She understood, in a way, the frustration of being misunderstood. But she also saw the potential within him, the spark that made him different. Maybe we can show them, she said softly, an idea forming in her mind. There's the science fair coming up. You could enter your project, show everyone what you can do. Ethan's eyes widened as he looked at her, his expression a mixture of fear and excitement. I don't know, he muttered. What if they still don't understand? What if they just think it's weird? Then let them, Sarah replied with a smile. But I don't think they will. I think they'll be amazed, just like I am. Her words lingered in the air, filling him with a strange, unfamiliar feeling, hope. For so long, he'd kept his talent hidden, afraid of what others would think. But now, with Sarah's encouragement, he felt a flicker of courage. Maybe, he said slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. Maybe I could. Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement. I'll help you. We'll work on it together, and we'll make sure everything's perfect. You're going to show them what you're really capable of, Ethan. I promise. As they left the school together, Ethan felt a warmth spreading through him, a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. With Sarah's support, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to hide his brilliance anymore. The following week, Miss Harlow stood at the front of her class with a new level of energy. A poster adorned with bold letters hung on the chalkboard, reading, Annual Science Fair, 3 weeks to go. The words loomed over the students, and Miss Harlow's gaze swept over them, her face stern but animated. Class, she announced, her tone carrying a weight that demanded attention. As you know, the science fair is approaching. It's not only a tradition at our school, but an opportunity for you to show your skills, creativity, and commitment to hard work. Participation is mandatory, and I expect each of you to bring your very best. Ethan's heart raced. For years, he dreamed of entering the science fair, imagining his inventions displayed for others to see. But he'd never had the courage to share his work publicly. Now, as Miss Harlow continued her instructions, he felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation bubbling within him. Beside him, Sarah leaned over and whispered, This is it, Ethan. This is your chance. Ethan swallowed, glancing up at Miss Harlow, whose gaze lingered on him just a moment longer than necessary. He could see the challenge in her eyes, a subtle dare that hinted she doubted his ability to perform. For a split second, their eyes met, and he saw a flicker of something. Whether it was doubt, curiosity, or resentment, he couldn't tell. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and Miss Harlow spoke over the growing buzz of students packing up. Remember, this isn't just any project. It's a chance to set yourselves apart. Impress me. Her voice hardened on the last words, her gaze resting on Ethan as he stuffed his notebook into his bag. As the students filed out, Miss Harlow called after him. Ethan, a word? He hesitated, his stomach knotting as he approached her desk. Sarah cast a supportive glance back at him before disappearing into the hallway. Ethan, Miss Harlow began, her tone unusually measured. I saw some of the calculations you were working on the other day. They were different from what I assigned. He nodded, unsure of what to say. She'd never shown interest in his work before, and he wasn't certain if her tone was one of criticism or reluctant admiration. Are you thinking of entering the science fair? She asked, her voice carrying a faint edge, almost like a challenge. I am, he replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. He could feel his hands growing clammy as he held her gaze, determined not to shrink under her scrutiny. Miss Harlow's lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan, I hope you understand that this is a serious commitment. The science fair isn't a place for experiments that aren't fully thought through. It's a competition meant for those who put in the effort. Ethan felt a surge of defiance rise within him. He'd worked harder on his project than she could ever imagine, pouring his heart and countless hours into it. How could she look at him as though he hadn't earned this chance? Yes, Miss Harlow, I know, he said, his voice more assertive than he intended. I'll bring my best work. For a moment, she seemed taken aback, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if reconsidering her opinion of him. Then, with a slight nod, she dismissed him. Very well, I'll expect nothing less. As Ethan walked out of the room, a newfound determination settled over him. He was done hiding, done allowing Miss Harlow's dismissive attitude to hold him back. This science fair would be his opportunity to prove not just to her, but to himself, that he was more than what she assumed. After school, Ethan met Sarah in the library, where they had decided to work on his project together. She greeted him with an excited smile, her hands full of books on engineering, mechanics, and physics. The sight of her enthusiasm filled him with a sense of belonging he'd never felt before. "So," she said, setting the books down on the table with a triumphant grin, "where do we start?" Ethan couldn't help but laugh, feeling his usual nerves give way to excitement. He opened his notebook, flipping to a page filled with schematics, calculations, and sketches of the device he'd been designing. It was a project he called the Synapse, a small yet complex machine designed to replicate brain neuron interactions. His goal was to create a device that could demonstrate basic principles of artificial intelligence, something that, to his knowledge, no one at his age had ever attempted. Sarah's eyes widened as she examined the notebook. "Ethan, this is incredible. I knew you were good, but this—" Her voice trailed off, all clear in her expression. "This is genius." He felt his cheeks redden. "Thanks. I've been working on it for months, but I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to show anyone." "Well, now's your chance," Sarah replied, her voice filled with encouragement, "and I'll be here to help you every step of the way." For the next few hours, they pored over the details of the project, discussing each component, brainstorming solutions, and making lists of materials they'd need. Sarah proved to be a diligent partner, picking up on his ideas quickly and even offering insights he hadn't considered. As they worked, Ethan felt his confidence grow. With each passing moment, the doubt Miss Harlow had planted in his mind faded, replaced by an unshakable belief in his own abilities. Sarah's support made all the difference, her unwavering faith in him pushing him to dream bigger. Over the next few days, Miss Harlow kept a closer watch on Ethan. She couldn't explain the gnawing curiosity that had taken hold of her, the feeling that she might have underestimated him. She caught glimpses of his project from afar, noticing the careful precision with which he worked and the fervor that filled his eyes when he was deep in thought. One afternoon, while grading papers in the faculty lounge, she overheard two teachers discussing the upcoming science fair. "Did you hear about Ethan Clark's project?" one of them whispered, excitement in her voice. "Apparently, he's working on something extraordinary, a project about artificial intelligence." Miss Harlow felt a prickle of unease at the mention of Ethan's name. She remembered his quiet defiance, the way he'd spoken to her, as though he believed he had something to prove. And now, hearing the other teachers speak of him with such admiration, a pang of jealousy crept in. Artificial intelligence? She thought of the countless late nights she'd spent in college, struggling through similar concepts, and how she'd rarely received recognition for her efforts. The idea of a student, especially one she'd written off as inattentive and lazy, succeeding where she had once struggled, filled her with an uncomfortable mix of resentment and regret. Later that day, Miss Harlow found herself watching Ethan as he left the classroom, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. For years, she'd prided herself on her ability to recognize potential, to push students to achieve greatness. But with Ethan, she'd failed. She realized with a sinking feeling that she had dismissed his talent because it didn't conform to her expectations. Determined not to let her mistake go uncorrected, she decided to investigate further. If Ethan was, indeed, the prodigy his project suggested, she wanted to be the one to witness his brilliance firsthand. She would attend the science fair and observe his presentation, even if she wasn't entirely sure she could let go of the resentment that clung to her. On the night before the science fair, Ethan sat in his room, putting the final touches on his project. The device hummed softly, every gear and wire in place, every calculation double-checked. He felt a thrill of satisfaction, knowing that all his hard work, his nights of quiet dedication, had led to this moment. Sarah had been there earlier, helping him test the last components and offering words of encouragement. She had assured him, over and over, that no matter the outcome, he had already achieved something remarkable. But as he sat there, staring at the device, he felt a pang of nervousness. The science fair would be the moment of truth. He'd be standing before his classmates, his teachers, and Ms. Harlow, who would finally see him for who he was. Not the quiet, distracted student she'd believed him to be, but a mind brimming with ideas and potential. For a long moment, he sat in silence, letting the weight of the upcoming day sink in. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be the day he changed everything. The day of the science fair arrived with a buzz of excitement that rippled through the school. Banners decorated the hallways, tables lined the gymnasium, and each space was covered in a patchwork of cardboard displays, models, and projects. Students moved about, setting up their projects, eyes darting between their own work and the competition around them. Ethan arrived early, carrying his device carefully in his arms, his face a mask of concentration. Beside him, Sarah walked with equal care, occasionally glancing up at him to gauge his mood. She could sense his nervousness beneath the calm exterior, and she reached out, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to blow everyone away, Ethan," she said with a smile. "You've worked so hard for this." He nodded, trying to absorb her confidence, but his gaze kept drifting to the entrance, where students, parents, and teachers were already gathering. He felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, the fear that he might disappoint them, or worse, that Ms. Harlow might dismiss him once again. But as he glanced at his device, a surge of determination replaced his anxiety. This was his moment. He had poured everything into this project, and today he would show them all that he was more than just a struggling student. When the fair began, students presented their projects one by one. Some were well done but expected: volcanoes, solar system models, simple chemical reactions. The teachers moved around the room, nodding approvingly, their faces lighting up with smiles of encouragement. Ms. Harlow entered the gymnasium with her usual air of calm authority, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ethan. He met her gaze, his heart pounding, but he stood his ground, refusing to look away. She offered a curt nod before turning her attention to the next student, but something in her expression hinted at a reluctant curiosity. Ethan and Sarah set up their display with care, arranging the device on a small stand and placing a poster board behind it, where they'd drawn diagrams of its inner workings and labeled each component. A small sign in front read, "The Synapse, a model of artificial intelligence." As the crowd moved closer, whispers began to spread. Students and parents alike murmured in surprise, eyes widening as they took in the title. Words like artificial intelligence and neuron model spread through the room, drawing even more attention to Ethan's table. Finally, Ms. Harlow made her way over, her expression one of guarded interest. She stood before Ethan's table, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting silently as he gathered his courage. With a quick glance at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod, Ethan took a deep breath and began his presentation. "This is the Synapse," he said, gesturing to the device. "It's a model designed to mimic the behavior of neurons, the cells in our brains that help us think, remember, and learn. I created this device to demonstrate how basic artificial intelligence can work, even on a small scale." Ms. Harlow raised an eyebrow, her skepticism apparent. "Go on, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. Ethan continued, explaining the device's design and the mathematical principles he'd used to create it. As he spoke, he grew more confident, his passion shining through as he described the challenges he'd faced and the solutions he'd devised. He pointed to each part, explaining how it contributed to the overall function, his words clear and precise. "And now, if you'll watch closely," he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement, "I'll show you how it works." He pressed a small switch on the side of the device, and it began to hum softly, the gears turning smoothly. Tiny lights blinked in succession, and a small screen displayed patterns that shifted in response to stimuli Ethan had pre-programmed into it. The device processed the information and displayed responses based on the simulated neuron interactions, an extraordinary feat for a middle school project. The crowd leaned in, captivated by the display. Whispers of awe rippled through the audience, and several teachers exchanged impressed glances. Even Ms. Harlow seemed momentarily speechless, her eyes fixed on the device with a look of reluctant admiration. Finally, she cleared her throat, regaining her composure. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer than usual, "this is impressive, more than impressive, really." She hesitated, the words seeming to catch in her throat as she looked at him with a mixture of pride and regret. "I didn't realize that you were capable of something like this." Ethan felt a lump in his throat as he met her gaze. He'd spent months waiting for this moment, imagining what it would feel like to finally prove himself, to see the acknowledgement in her eyes. Yet, now that it was here, all he felt was a quiet sense of peace, as if he'd finally found his place. Ms. Harlow's expression softened, and she nodded, almost to herself. "You've done well, Ethan. Very well." As she walked away, he turned to Sarah, who grinned at him with pride. "You did it, Ethan. You showed them all." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had done it, not for Ms. Harlow, not for anyone else, but for himself. The science fair ended with Ethan's project awarded first place. His name echoed in applause as he accepted the certificate, his heart swelling with pride. As he stood on the stage, he could see his classmates looking up at him with newfound admiration. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not as the quiet, distracted student he'd always been, but as someone capable, talented, and worthy of respect. Afterward, Miss Harlow approached him, her face devoid of the usual sternness. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite place, something between pride and regret. "Ethan," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you. I assumed you were a student who didn't care, who didn't want to try, but you've shown me that I was wrong, and for that, I'm sorry." Ethan looked at her, taking in the sincerity in her eyes. A part of him wanted to hold on to the resentment he'd felt, to remind her of all the times she'd belittled him. But as he looked at her, he realized he no longer needed that. She had seen him now, truly seen him, and that was all he had ever wanted. "Thank you, Miss Harlow," he replied quietly. "I appreciate it." She nodded, her face softening. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Ethan. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, not even yourself." As she walked away, Ethan felt a sense of closure. He had spent so much of his life hiding, shrinking away from his potential, fearing judgment and failure. But now, standing there with his certificate in hand, he realized that he was free. Free to dream, to create, to be whoever he wanted to be. Sarah joined him, her face glowing with pride. "So, genius, what's next?" she asked with a playful grin. Ethan smiled, his mind already racing with new ideas, new possibilities. "I don't know," he said, laughing, "but whatever it is, I won't be hiding it." As they left the school that day, the weight of his insecurities lifted, replaced by a boundless sense of hope. The world felt bigger, brighter, filled with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. And as he looked ahead, he knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would take him far beyond the walls of Ms. Harlow's classroom. For the first time, Ethan felt ready to embrace the genius within him, knowing he'd never have to hide again.